How the wrists work throughout the golf swing truly is the foundation of both power production and club face control. In this video, I'll share with you the role of the wrists and how that newfound information can help you to unlock better ball striking, greater accuracy, and increased distance. Let's start by explaining the range of motion of the wrists and how you can define them. It's a complex joint, one which has lots of movement and potential ranges of motion. We're going to explain how the wrists work in 3 planes of motion. First of all, we have the up and down nature of the wrist cock or the wrist hinge. This would be the wrists working in this vertical fashion, up and down. When you cock the wrists upwards or hinge them upwards, this is referred to as radial deviation, where you're hinging the wrists upwards. And that movement in the wrist would typically be associated with some power production, but at the same time, it's also associated with keeping the club face a little bit more open and would be associated with hitting higher shots. If you went the opposite way and uncocked the wrists, so move the wrists in a downward fashion, where the wrist is arched at the top here and the fingers are pointing more down towards the ground, that's ulnar deviation. And the downward cocking of the wrists, like so, would be associated with hitting the ball lower and closing the club face. The next piece to speak about would be the rotation of the wrists and how the turning and twisting of the shaft with the wrists and the forearms both controls the club face and the directional pattern of your shots, as well as the power production in terms of delaying this release and then firing that power into the ball. The movements can be described as supination of the forearms or pronation of the forearms. The easiest way to remember this is that supination would be when you're holding a bowl of soup in your hands. That would be the upward description, and then turn down would be pronation. And in golf, the lead arm and the trail arm work in opposites. So when one arm is pronating, the other arm is supinating. That would be the backswing movement. And then in the downswing and the follow through, the lead arm would start to supinate all the way into the follow through, and the trail arm would pronate. You just need to know that those motions happen, and from a directional control point of view, you can use this information to understand whether you need to add more pronation or take some away. And then finally, the flexion and extension of the wrists, the twisting of the wrists in this horizontal plane, where the hands would turn inwards like so, would be described as flexion of the wrists, where they're bowed. And the opposite would be where the hands or the fingers are pointing away from me, and I have this angle in the back of my wrist, this cupping. That's extension of the wrists. And once again, in golf, they work opposite to each other. They work in these pairs where if one wrist is flexing, the other one is extending, and vice versa. How that affects your golf club would be to say that if I took this club here in its standard condition with a square face, and I moved this lead wrist into the most amount of flexion, twisting it so now it's bowed and in a more flexed place, you'll see what that's done to the club face. Notice how the club face now is not pointing straight up and down. The bottom edge of the club here, the leading edge, goes from this vertical condition into this turned or twisted one where it's very closed. So flexion of the lead wrist would be associated with more of a closing of the club face. Equally, if I flip that on its head and took the same neutral setup and turned my lead wrist into the most amount of extension, so I added more angle here, so there's a maximum angle between the forearm and the back of the hand, this cupping or extension as it's described has now opened the club face. Swinging back, that club face would look very, very different in this down the line camera view, with the club face pointing up to the sky. This would be considered a very open club face, a very weak club face. It's typically associated with slicing the ball and loss of distance. The opposite would be true if I was to flex the lead wrist. I would close the club face more, and that would be associated more with hooking the ball to the left and more powerful shots. So now you're more familiar with the way that the wrists move throughout the swing. We should hit some shots and try to show you the differences in some of those movements. It's worth noting at this point, there's no perfect way to move the wrists. Every golfer has a slightly different and individual pattern, but there are certainly windows of acceptance, and there are patterns. There are ways that good players move their wrists in general, and you should be trying to achieve those patterns as well. It's also worth noting at the moment that you are already twisting your wrists on this golf club as you swing it. To you, it just feels like your natural swing, but what you're doing, for those of you struggling to control direction and losing power, you're twisting this club incorrectly. So this is a case of educating yourself on how the wrists move, using the HackMotion to measure what's going on at the wrist level, and to be able to get real-time data as to how you're moving these wrists. If we take a look at the avatar now, you'll just see that we've got the twisting piece of the wrist there. I've got the extension and flexion, and I've got the up, the ulnar, and the radial. The radial is up. You'll see that's moving up to 17 degrees and then down into ulnar, 28 degrees. So the flexion, extension, the radial, ulnar, and we've got this rotational component as well. Solid little shot there, just drew it slightly to the left, very, very slightly to the left of the target. I'm hitting an 8-iron here. You'll see, looking at the numbers there, you'll see how you get the feedback on address, top of the swing and impact for the flexion, the ulnar radial, and the rotation. And I think that's really interesting to look at. The pattern of good players from a flexion and extension point of view would be that golfers start with a small amount of extension in their wrist, should their wrist and should their grip be relatively neutral. You'll see there that I've got 9 degrees of extension at setup. By the time I get to the top, I've taken that extension out and replaced it with a very small amount of flexion. Effectively, what I've done as I've swung back is I've twisted my wrist very slightly into this flat or slightly flexed condition. So at the top, my left wrist and my forearm are more or less in a flat condition. And that would produce a club face that's very neutral. The club face there at the top of my backswing, the angle of that leading edge and those grooves really more or less matches my wrist angle. That would be considered a very neutral place to be at the top of the swing. And then as I swing down, you'll notice by the time I get to impact, I'm actually adding more flexion. So I'm twisting this club face more closed in theory, and that allows me to keep the shaft more forward when I hit the ball, which we know is desirable for good ball striking, solid contact, and good distance. So I'm able to keep the shaft moving forwards at impact because of the added flexion I've put into this lead wrist, that twisting down of the club. And that pattern would be very common among good players. You'll see them start in a small amount of extension, you'll see them lose that extension to the top, and then you'll see no more extension in the downswing. You'll see flexion, slight twisting of the club down into the ball. As I say, that allows for a stronger delivery of club face or loft, which means you can hit the ball further, and it allows you to lean the shaft, which is a huge component in terms of striking the ball first and the ground second. Let's take a look at a swing where I consciously, intentionally add more extension in my lead wrist in the backswing. This is a common pattern of high handicap golfers who don't hit the ball very far and who typically slice the ball to the right for right-handed golfers. This pattern of wrist movement is usually associated with people trying to lengthen their swing. They've been told they're supposed to hinge their wrists for extra distance or extra power. What's worth noting here in the app, as you take a look at the measurements of the wrist at the moment, you'll see how that's 9 degrees of extension, which is exactly where I started my swing before. If I swing back and consciously add more extension, you'll see there how there's 58 degrees of extension. That's an enormous difference in terms of the angle of my wrist and the angle of my club face at the top of the swing. And it feels to me like a very weak position. But for many of you who've got used to swinging your wrists and twisting your wrists like this will feel very powerful. You'll feel like this is where you're getting your power from, but it's misguided feel because it's not producing the reel that you want. I can go from the top here into that extended condition with 33 degrees of radial deviation. That's the upward hinging of the wrist that we spoke about. That upward hinging of the wrist is necessary for producing power. But if you're not careful, as you move your wrist up, you'll combine it with twisting the lead wrist into extension, which opens the club face, and that's what's getting you into trouble. You can go back, you can keep this wrist flat. You'll see there it's 4 degrees, there we go, 5 degrees of flexion, 3 degrees of flexion, 22 degrees of radial deviation. I'm still adding the radial, I'm still adding the wrist hinge, I'm still cocking my wrists, but I'm not compromising the club face. This is the high handicap pattern. The twisting the face open in the backswing, lots of extension at the top of the swing, and typically balls that fly very, very, very high, they slice to the right, and they don't go very far. You'll see there on the screen how that ball started to the right, curved more to the right. It went 106 yards compared to 150 something on my first shot. That's an enormous difference in terms of potential power. This is an 8 iron. And you'll see here, looking at the screen, I started in basically the same amount of extension at setup. So my grip was the same. I didn't make any changes there. That was 11 degrees of extension as opposed to 9 degrees, so effectively the same. But at the top of the swing, I was in 38 degrees of extension. If you remember the shot before, my standard shot, I was in 3 degrees of flexion. That's a 41 degree difference in how much I twisted this wrist. As I came back to hit the ball, I managed to get the wrist back into this 0 condition. And this is something that I've spoken about before on previous videos, how good players have an awareness of where this club face is in space. So if it's completely out of position as it was in that demonstration of mine, I'm going to be trying to subconsciously fix that in that very last part of the swing. And it's interesting because that's exactly what you're doing with your poor club face control. At some level you understand that this club face is not in a good spot to hit the ball how you want to. And so you spend the last part of your downswing stalling with your body, flipping with your wrists to try and square this club face and make it somewhat functional. All the time you're doing that, you're robbing yourself of distance and you're making it much more likely that you hit the ground before the ball. Fat, thin shots would be typical. Somewhat similar to my standard again, I just wanted to hit one out there that was more neutral. That's gone 166 yards. You'll see again the pattern of the wrist from setup, small amount of extension, top of the swing, 0 or 1 degree of extension, very much flat wrist. That wrist is twisted, so the wrist is flat, and then coming down to hit the ball, 11 degrees of flex, that twisting the club face slightly closed, that allows me the desirable shaft lean position at impact. And of course there are some of you out there that are overdoing the closing piece. I would say that typically the slicing pattern is more obvious and more commonly seen, but it's very possible to twist this club too much in an attempt potentially to close the face and stop yourself from slicing. The great thing about this device is it's going to highlight that for you. Another reason why a lot of golfers would get too much flexion in their wrist during the swing and close the face would be down to how they hold the club. So it's incredibly important that you're looking at your grip as a first port of call when it comes to improving your wrist angles throughout the swing. In this one, I'll consciously twist the face too much. You'll see here now how my lead wrist has this bowed condition, and there's 44 degrees of flex on the screen, which is significant. The club face is now twisted way past the neutral condition and is extremely closed. So if I go ahead and hit this one, the expectation would be this ball would go a long way to the left. There's a lot of curve on that ball. And remember, this is only an 8 iron. So that amount of curve on an 8-iron is significant. The one thing you may notice there, though, in terms of distance, 159 yards, when you have the club face more closed, the one thing you're less likely to suffer from is a loss of power, because you're still able to turn this club face down and effectively de-loft it. All that being said, you still want to work towards getting the face more neutral, so that a club face that's more square at impact will allow you to hit not just longer shots, but straighter shots as well. So there's some information about the role of the wrists in the golf swing, and I think it's fair to say not only are the role of the wrists important, they're an absolutely essential element of the swing to understand and master if you're going to truly improve your golf game. If you're ready to learn more, make sure you check out the link below, which will take you to a set of drills you can work on to improve your wrist motion throughout the golf swing.